Okay, I'd like to call this June 30th, 2016 meeting of the Urbana MOR Development Review Board to order. Can we begin with the roll call, please?
Mr. Cho, Mr. Kunkel,
Here.
Mr. Otto,
Here.
Mr. Foss,
Here.
Ms. Smith, here. Mr. Weisskopf.
Here.
Okay, that's definitely a quorum, and that's a quorum, and we're expecting our missing member to be arriving soon. Are there any changes to the agenda that we've got listed here? No changes? Okay. The next order is to approve the previous meeting minutes. I had just one minor correction. I don't recall that it took me 2.5 hours to bring the meeting to order. So I'm not sure if did we start that one at 5, or was that a 7:30?
We'll verify, but I think it was a 5:30.
5.
But-
Okay.
but we'll check
So
and
neither of those
adjust
is
that.
correct. Okay. I do have one question pertaining to the minutes, but I think we can approve them first before I follow up with that. Do we have somebody willing to? Should we approve the
I
minutes?
move approval of the minutes.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, they're approved. I did have one question about the history of the MOR. We've been it's stated on page 3 that we had discussed this idea of looking into that history with the idea of being able to, through that history, maybe get a better sense of the success that we've had thus far with the MOR district. Do we have any update on that information?
I'll be passing out a very brief memo later on in the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Okay, are there, number 4, are there any communications? No? There's no continuance of public hearings. Is there any old business?
Well, there's still the discussion of the bylaws, but we are still in the process of creating a downtown design district, which may include, should it be approved that way, design review. And at that point, we would, of course, want to look at doing a combination of boards. So that would make sense to complete that process before revising the bylaws for this board, because it might end up all being one board.
Right. Okay. Number 7, new public hearings.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, is there a script you're going to read or process?
Script. Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, I'd like to open the public hearing for case number DRB-2016-01. We hear the staff summary, please.
Good evening. This is for a property proposed on 708 and 710 West Green Street, a request by Andrew Fell, the applicant, on behalf of Dr. Chaudhry, who is the property owner. These are two vacant properties at their respective addresses located on the 700 block of West Green Street. The applicant, or the property owner, purchased the properties and learned that there was an 82-inch storm sewer without an easement that exists on the eastern edge of the 708 West Green Street property. That would be the property on the right if you've looked at some of the site plans, that it several feet off the eastern property line. It's parallel to the property line for the most part. That requires a 10-foot buffer from our Public Works Department that limits the buildable area on that particular lot. The property has received minor variances for a reduction in their allowed side yard. I miswrote the cases. Those are two separate ZBA cases in which basically the minimum required front yard setback was reduced from 25 feet to 20 feet for both of those properties. The property owner and the applicant would like to construct two new buildings on each of those properties. And just a quick review of the MOR intent based out of the zoning ordinance is to encourage a mixture of residential office and small-scale businesses, small-scale business land uses that are limited in scale and intensity, and designed and constructed to be incompatible with existing structures in the district. The objectives: encourage compatibility by minimizing impacts between proposed land uses in the surrounding area, encourage the design of new construction to be compatible with the neighborhood's visual and aesthetic character through the use of design guidelines, and determine if proposed development plans meet the intent of the district as stated in section 42H. Just to briefly mention also, 708 is a building that will feature 5 units with approximately 3,416 square feet. 710 will feature 6 units with approximately 4,035 square feet. It should be noted that the property at 710, which is the property to the left if you're looking at the site plan, is legally non-conforming in terms of its lot width. The minimum lot width is supposed to be 60 feet for districts in the MOR. You'll see some of the other characteristics. Both of the buildings are 34.75 feet high. They have they meet the requirements of the open space ratio for being 0.3. You'll see their corresponding FARs as well for each building. The required side yard setback in the MOR is at least 7 feet from each property side with a cumulative total of 17. So if one side is 7 feet, the other must be 10 feet. You'll see the rear yard setbacks are well from the rear property line. Both of these are rather narrow properties and lengthy in that regard. They have a requirement of 11 parking spaces as well. It might have said in the zoning data that there were 12 required spaces. There are only 11, and that was what the applicant provided in the design. Another characteristic that we'll be coming back to once or twice is that in the MOR district, that every building that exceeds 25 feet must have an increased side and rear yard setback of 3 feet for every 10 feet. That being, for these proposed buildings, they are 34.75 feet. They are over 25 feet. That means that the side yards have an increased requirement of 3 feet on each side, as opposed to 7 feet, or as opposed to 7 feet on each side. The rear yards are well beyond it would be a required rear yard of 16 feet, both of which is met on each property. So the consideration that we'll be mentioning is for the side yards in this
Just to
proposal.
clarify, Chris, that would be a variance that would go in front of the zoning board, so that's not,
Or, yes, that will be a future variance that the applicant will have to seek that will be included as a condition for approval, or a recommended condition for approval in the staff report. Just wanted to briefly show the surrounding land uses. The subject properties which are highlighted feature two previously existing houses which are now demolished. You'll see that this is according to tax code data that there are other duplexes and like-minded or likewise single-family homes on the block face. To the north, there is a large apartment building as well as some other duplexes and single-family homes. Across the street, there is a larger multi-unit apartment building and several other duplexes and single-family homes. So for the MOR criteria, there's compatibility with surrounding neighborhood, parking and access, screening and landscaping, and site details. This is an overhead shot of the surrounding neighborhood. I'd like to review that the property at 708 and the property at 710, those are the vacant spaces right now, the subject properties. You'll see 702, 704, 706, and then to the west, 712, 714. I took a few shots along the street to give you an idea of where the other buildings on the block are located and just their the relationship to each other in the following photos. You'll see 714 in the upper left-hand corner. That is the furthest western building. You go to the right, you'll see 712. That was a building more recently constructed, but under MOR district requirements, or the only building that's been constructed since the creation of the MOR. The two subject properties, which are vacant, I didn't include pictures of. You'll see then 706, which is the first property to the east of the subject properties, and then I took a picture of 706, 704, 702 in line with each other. There's a better picture of 704 and 702 slightly obscured by tree cover. And then that picture at the bottom is looking west. That's sort of looking the other direction then. That's from the corner with starting at 702 and then 704 to the left of that. The proposed buildings are dwelling, multiple family, which is permitted by right in the MOR district. Also, I mentioned with compatibility in the surrounding neighborhood, the MOR district guidelines call for an overall similarity of architectural features as well as similar placement of buildings as well. You'll see that the buildings have pitched roofs, hipped roofs as well, similar location of windows, transparency, shingled exteriors, patterned shingles as well as kind of a brick veneer base at the bottom. And lap siding of height, they're 2 to 2.5, approximately 3 stories tall. Their setbacks range from 20 to 35 feet. They all have driveways or parking placed in the rear if they have a driveway at all. The proposed buildings would have front-facing entrances like most of the buildings. They would have parking faced in the rear. It would have a driveway that runs over the sewer line, but that is permitted by the recommended guidelines from the city's Public Works Department. It would have screened parking in the rear as well. A 6-foot cedar fence would be forming the exterior of the parking located towards the rear. There would be a handicap space provided, meeting the zoning ordinance requirements. For the screening and landscaping, There would be one tree which has been preserved. It's a 36-foot maple, which is located in the front.
36-inch diameter.
Oh, 36-inch diameter. I'm sorry. There's also a 16-inch diameter Siberian elm located in the public right-of-way, which will have to be removed. The city arborist says that this is a tree of lesser value, and the city would be compensated for the removal of that tree as is required for city code. The subject properties would also feature shrubs, roughly a dozen surrounding each building to provide landscaping. There would also be a raised planter in the shared space in between both of the properties. For some of the site details, there would be a trash receptacle located in the northeast corner of the 708 property. It would be screened and from both the right-of-way and public view. The AC unit for the 708 property would be on the east side, located towards the rear. It would also be screened by shrubs. For the 710 property, it would be located in the northwest corner of the building, kind of towards the rear. It would also be screened from the public view by shrubs, as well as just its general placement near the building. So for mandatory design criteria, the MOR guidelines call for a front entrance that faces the street, building walls facing the street containing windows and transparency, and parking areas located behind the building. And you'll see that of all the design guidelines, including massing and scale openings, outdoor living space, materials, parking areas, landscaping. So for the facade zone, this is completely new construction, so the first criteria would not necessarily, of strongly encouraged, would not apply, but encourages the location of mechanical equipment to be located outside of the view from the public right-of-way, which is basically the facade, what the guidelines mean when they mention facade zone. As I mentioned earlier, the AC units and the trash receptacles will be located further to the rear of the property. They'll be screened or concealed from public view as well. Also, the parking would be located in the rear as well, preserving the facade zone in that regard. Front-facing entrances, as already mentioned. For building orientation and patterns, the encouraged guidelines are building placement and general orientation on a site that's compatible with other structures on the block, that being similar placement of buildings, similar setbacks, similar height in relationship to its location on the property. That also includes the patterns located on the outside of the building, be it the types of shingles, the roof materials, the types of windows, materials that for the new construction would be comparable to the other buildings in the block. Most of the buildings on 700 West Green were built in the early to mid 20th century, with the exception of 712, which was built in the late 90s. But the proposed buildings would offer generally similar traits as the other buildings. As I mentioned, they preserve the lot lines that are currently existing. They would have lap siding, shingles, sort of the symmetrical pattern of the windows on each floor. They would also have gabled roofs like the other buildings. So the general patterns would be mostly the same, as well as that brick veneer base, which is found on some of the other buildings at the bottom. So for the massing and for the scale of the buildings, the guidelines encourage a height to width ratio of a structure that's compatible with the other structures in the block. So that if it's 2 to 1, it'd be 2 to 1 or 1 to 3, etc. The ratios for most of the properties on the block range from approximately 1 to 2 to 1 to 1. The ratio for 708 West Green would be slightly taller than a 1 to 1 ratio. The ratio for 710 West Green would be about 1 to 1. 708 is the property that has the buildable area, which is restricted by the sewer line that runs on the eastern edge of the property. Just go up. You'll see that the sewer line runs along right here, so it already has a restricted buildable area. 710, the property to the west, you'll see is constrained as it is a legally non-conforming lot. It is 53 feet as opposed to the required 60-foot width. Just want to double check that. So those two constraints limit the amount of area that any structure would be able to build on. The other encouraged criterion include the use of decorative materials that add interest and scale dimension, height and roof lines that are similar to buildings on the block, roof heights that are similar, pitches of the roof that are similar, and varying roof lines that sort of break up the mass a little bit. And especially with new construction, they ask that they be similar. The height for both buildings would be 34.75 feet. Generally, they are the same height as most of the other buildings on the block. They would be a little rather tall. It'd be a few inches taller than the building at 712 West Green Street, which was the most recently constructed building of the others on that block. The rear depth of the building would not be greater than most of the existing buildings on the block, seeing that they have rather comparable front yard setbacks and the parking is located in the rear. So the rear depth would not be that greater either, that much greater or less than. The roofs would also be gabled, which is similar to some of the other roofs on the other structures on the block. For openings, the strongly encouraged is an adequate amount of windows and transparency on the facade. It discourages large wall expanses with a blank canvas that's not interrupted by windows. Strongly encouraged openings that reflect the building's architectural style. Also, windows that have a sort of a pattern or rhythm consistency that are symmetrical or located in some kind of orderly fashion. The windows that face the facade zone, as well as the properties to the east and the west of the subject properties, contain a generous amount of windows that are orderly, both vertically and horizontally. Towards the facade zone, there's good visibility, good transparency. This is for the 708 building. The west wall would be the wall facing the other building owned on the subject properties. So It's also similar for 710 that its eastern wall would have a similar amount of transparency. So the two walls that have the least amount of window openings are the ones facing each other, both owned by the property owner. But you'll see that the windows on 710 are generally comparable to the proposed windows for 708. For outdoor living space, it strongly encourages front porches and balconies with roof lines compatible with the main roof. Variety of styles and materials to complement the overall composition of the building. Encourages porches, flat roof porches that serve as covered balconies for the second floor, balconies on multi-family residence located above the first floor. It encourages patios that are directly abutting any households or ones that are located in the facade zone. Each building does contain, I'll just scroll back up, you'll see a small patio near its front-facing entrance that would extend several feet outward south from the building. Same for the 708 as well. There aren't any balconies or terraces that are proposed for either of these buildings. They do provide outdoor living space in general in the front yard. For materials, the guidelines strongly encourage materials that have a traditional look similar to that of the district, but also have a little bit of diversity, a little bit of variety, as well as a durability, ones that will protect the integrity of the structure. So sort of serving a dual purpose of providing a visual aesthetic and then a durability and long-lasting quality for their use. Both properties would be using a hardy plank and hardy shingle siding. They would be repeating that brick veneer base at the bottom. The roof would be fiberglass shingles. It would be a metal roof over the front porch entrance. But the materials are rather newer. They would provide a good durability that mimics the traditional look of some of the older buildings on the block. For parking areas, the guidelines encourage using existing alleyway. It doesn't really apply to this area, but it encourages screening of the rear parking area, of screening of the parking, reducing the visual impact of nearby properties, screening with fences or with shrubbery. The other guidelines, as we mentioned previously, encourage rear-located parking, which both of these properties do. They also provide a traditional driveway access to the rear of the properties for the parking. They're screened with a cedar fence. They're also screened with bushes as well. So they generally meet the guidelines as required for the parking. For landscaping, generally the retention of any possible trees, both within the public right-of-way or on the private property, are encouraged. It also encourages new tree plantings if possible, protecting existing trees, but also landscaping that preserves pedestrian and automobile circulation. The proposal would be preserving the large maple tree towards the front. It would be removing a tree in the public right-of-way that was discussed earlier, although the arborist mentioned that it's a tree of poor value. The proposal would be adding the approximately 24 shrubs surrounding both buildings, as well as...
Correct that number, please, Chris.
I'm
24,
sorry.
I think, might be the number. I thought I heard 1,000, so I just want to make sure.
I
24
meant to say dozen.
shrubs.
24, not 2,000. That'd be a lot. There's also a planter in the shared space between both of the buildings that might feature flowers or landscaping. The existing curb cut for one of the driveways to the existing building would be removed, but that would be restored. The parkway would be maintained. It's also the staff analysis of the proposed parking and access drive determined, with the landscaping, determined that the circulation would not be compromised with the proposal. So commercial site design guidelines, this isn't a commercial building, so those guidelines do not apply. The Development Review Board has 3 options. You may approve the application. You may approve the application with conditions relating to meeting the standards and design guidelines of the MOR district. You may continue the case if you decide you need more information, additional information from the applicant, or further consideration of the application. You may deny the application. If you do so, you should articulate the findings supporting denial. In the event that the board denies the application, the case may be appealed to the Urbana Zoning Board of Appeal for final approval or disapproval of the application as proposed, as stated in the zoning ordinance. Staff has 3 recommendations for approval of the design. First, that the construction be in general conformance with the attached site plan, floor plans, elevations. The second criteria is that the applicant shall obtain a variance for each lot to allow for the reduced side yard along the shared property line. And then I'll address that one in just a moment. The third, that the fence in the rear and side yards be an opaque wood fence of at least 6 feet in height. Regarding the fence that would be surrounding the parking, staff, this isn't stated in the memorandum. Staff recommends that the fencing extend around the perimeter of the property to extend eastward to where it might provide some visibility in the facade zone as well as of the AC unit. Not that it would be a drastic amount, but the applicant is open to including. So just maybe some language that suggests the fencing extend around the entire perimeter of the parking area that does not, that isn't near the access drive. The other thing I wanted to clarify was regarding the variance that it must seek for setback. So in the MOR district, it states that both side yards must be a cumulative 17 feet. With a minimum of 7 feet on each side, that means that the other side must be at least 10 feet. For 708, the property on the right, you'll see that it obviously meets that side yard setback. It's approximately 24 feet, I believe, and then 7 feet on its western property boundary that it shares with 710. Because the building is 34.75 feet in height, it would be required to have 10 feet on the western property line as opposed to 7 feet. So it would be a major variance that they would be required to seek that would allow a reduction from that being required to be 10 feet down to 7 feet. Same for the property at 710. The western property line, it has a setback of 10 feet as well, but the eastern property line against 708 would be, as proposed, is 7 feet, because that building is also 34.75 feet high. It would have the eastern property line, the one that it shares with the adjacent property, would be required to be 10 feet as opposed to 7. So the major variance, so technically 2 major variances that would be heard concurrently, it would be required to seek a major variance that would allow the reduction in that side yard setback from 10 feet to 7 feet. So basically, the variances would be for side yards of the two proposed buildings against each other that are owned by the same property owner. If you would need me to elaborate or explain it further, you can do so during the question session. I understand it might take a moment to digest. So with those three conditions, just as I said before, a suggestion that language be added to the third condition, that it extend around the full perimeter of the parking area that's not near the access drive. Did you have any questions that I might be able to elaborate on, or any information that you were wondering about?
I have a couple questions.
Yes.
So the site dimensions that are on here are different from what was in our packet. These are the correct ones.
The applicants submitted a revised plan with dimensions that were correct for the.
So rather than 60 feet, it is 60.77 feet.
Yeah.
That's, okay. In the zoning ordinance, it talks about parking and required setbacks in the MOR district. And it says that if you do park in the required yards, then you have to provide screening.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes down in paragraph G of that same article that where it's required, it has to be 3 feet from the property line.
I think that reference is actually when shade trees are required, which are only required if a parking lot is 20 spaces or more. I'll verify that, but I think the section that's referenced there is F, which has to do with shade trees.
Then my other question is, I assume that these properties are platted separately. This was a question that I had earlier. If 3 years from now, one of the properties is sold and you have access through 708, how does 710, how's that going to work?
I would have to verify that with our Public Works Department, but there would probably be a access easement that would be required. Lori?
Yeah, it's common to share parking, in which case you could require an access easement be provided to the 710 lot to ensure they have continual access.
And that's not uncommon of properties in MOR or the older neighborhoods in town. So,
Are any other questions from the board at this time?
I'm still trying to get that zoning thing sunk in my head, but since I'm on the zoning board also, is it kind of odd that we started in zoning, then it came here, and now we're sending it back? I mean, is that part of the contradiction of?
It wasn't by design, but it was a realization that the process for the minor variances for the front yard setback originally included a side yard setback, and the applicant received the front yard setbacks, but decided to make several changes to the site plan to where they initially were not going to seek the side yard setback, and then by the time the application for the design review board had been submitted and posted, there came because of the revisions and changes to the properties to get them to meet all the standards of FAR, OSR, things like that. It came to the realization that there would be a side yard variance required after all. It's not ideal, but it's just it's intended so it can meet the zoning ordinance requirements. And so, yeah, ideally we would not, this wasn't meant to be kicked back to ZBA for a separate matter, but it's just to make sure that everything's approved properly and right, so.
Okay. So it's a special case, I guess, in this
Yeah.
instance.
Yeah, ideally this would have been addressed earlier had it been realized, but because, this proposal was undergoing adjustments and changes on, two probably challenging lots to design on, so that's just the circumstances of this case.
Okay.
Any other staff comments at this time? Yeah, Dave.
I'd just like to follow up to be clear on the question about the driveway access. Is it appropriate for us to put as a condition that a recorded easement be filed as a condition of the permission, or does zoning board of ZBA do that? I run into this now and again on the plan commission where the representation's made that so-and-so has extra parking on this lot and so on, but nothing is ever recorded, and then time goes on and people forget it, and title transfers, and no one knows anything about anything. And so whose job is it to look after that? Can we put that as a condition so that we make sure it's taken care of?
I'll jump in. You can. We usually catch that at the building permit stage at any rate, but if you put it in a condition now, that gives the applicant plenty of time to work on that in advance of the building permit. And I also have an answer to Ms. Smith's question earlier, if I may. Confirmation that I believe the section you're referring to where 3 feet would be required along a parking lot would be only if parking lot screening is required in conformance with the sections entitled Special Conditions Requiring Shade Tree Plantings, where parking lots greater than 20 spaces require shade tree. So it would not apply in this instance since it has fewer than 20 parking spaces, therefore the 18 inches is an adequate space.
Okay.
It's a little confusing because it's saying in any zoning district where screening is required. I guess that's what, when I read that, I read it as any type of screening, whether it's fencing or, yeah, I don't know.
Okay, any other staff comments at this time? Okay, it's the petitioner's opportunity to present the evidence.
There's a copy of the memorandum loaded on the, if you need that.
I'm Andrew Fell, the applicant, and Mr. Marks, I think, did an excellent job of describing the project, so basically I'll answer questions that you have. I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add to his description, so.
Okay. Are there any staff questions for Mr. Fell? Yeah, board questions or staff questions. Probably exhausted all the staff questions.
Just one quick one on that. During staff's presentation, they noted the addition of that small section of fence on the west side of the property to screen that one last 9 or 10 feet of parking space that's there. Is it your preference to do fencing material, or would you be open to landscaping screening as an option?
Probably, I would say fencing material.
Okay.
I got hung up, and maybe if I'd studied it long enough, I could have figured it out. Exhibit D indicates a requested adjustment to the open space ratio, but then the discussion is of side yard, but the open space ratio meets standards.
Right,
doesn't it?
we through several processes of trying to squeeze these buildings on there, at one point we considered asking for an adjustment to the open space ratio, but we essentially, on 708, what we did was we knocked off a unit on the top floor so we could drop the square footage to meet the open space ratio. So we're asking for no other considerations.
So we can really ignore Exhibit D.
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
No questions, board questions for Mr. Fell? Okay, well, thank you
I'm
for
happy
your
to come back up if you
participation.
need anything. Thanks.
Are there any other proponents for this project here that would like to speak? Are there any opponents that would like to present evidence? Is there but anybody else who would like to speak? As we go down, any additional comments from staff? I guess there's no need for a petition or rebuttal. Any discussion by the board, the Plan Commission board? Well, perhaps we're ready to vote the case. Any discussion? Yes, Deanie.
I would like to add the condition that there be a recorded easement for parking before construction begins.
Yeah, I think, so perhaps we should vote on any conditions, or make the vote according to any conditions we have. I would also like to add an easement for that central walkway, since it's cut right down the property line, that should also be part of it, and as well as the bike parking. Any other amendments? Well, I have a couple comments. Can't get away without any comments. First of all, I appreciate the effort and skill that has gone into this set of drawings. I think it shows a real reflection and reaction to the MOR, a positive reaction, I think, to the MOR. And what I find interesting about it is that the requested variance actually, I think, creates another design opportunity that's been worked out, and that's with the central walkway. By decreasing the space, it really does create a kind of positive space. Reminds me somewhat of some of the alleyways in downtown Urbana, and I think it could have a similar characteristic with the right landscaping and textures. I would even propose a small gateway as a transition from the walk to the bike parking or something like that to begin to build that up. The other thing I would like to see is some lighting, some very low walk scaled lighting in that space, because I think that it could, with the strong lights into the parking lot, I think that could be a dark space, and I think that it really needs to be illuminated at night. So I would like to put that as a condition too, is to illuminate the central walkway. There's one other question I had, and I don't think that the MOR district requires this, but I would like to think about this, is that as of right now on the along the two properties, there are no street trees. There is the one, was the 36-foot wide diameter maple, or is it 36 inch? I know, okay. But it's on the property, and can we require the planting of street trees?
Probably the better option is to allow the arborist to make the determination if there's space at that location. Basically, because there would be a request to remove a street tree, the process is that the arborist determines if there can be another one placed in the general vicinity and have it survive. So rather than require an applicant to do something perhaps they don't have power over, it's probably best to allow the city arborist to decide if a street tree can go back there. That, of course, would be his preference, but he would need to evaluate it. There's a really nice London plane tree just to the east, and he wouldn't want to infringe on that root system. So that's probably the better option, because it is off their property, and therefore they don't have a lot of control over it.
Okay, then can we charge the board to contact the arborist to?
I'll let him know.
That? Okay, thank you. I mean, charge the staff, not the board. Okay, those are all the comments I have. Does anybody else have any follow-up comments, or should we call the vote?
Need a
Do you want a motion?
Oh, yeah, a motion.
Okay. I'll take a
Thank
shot
you.
at it if you want.
Okay.
I just move in the case of DRB 2016-01 that the board approve the petitioner's application with the following conditions: that the construction be in general conformance with the attached site plan, floor plans, and elevations. The applicant shall obtain a variance for each lot to allow for the reduced side yard along the shared property line. The fence in the rear and side yards be opaque wood fence of at least 6 feet in height, and the fence on the west side be extended to screen the south-facing parking space. That an access easement be recorded to provide access to 710 West Green Street across the 708 West Green Street property. That a similar access easement be recorded for the central walkway between the two properties, and that pedestrian scale illumination be provided along the central walkway.
Excellent. So that was the motion. Okay. Do we have a second? Okay. Let's call the vote.
Mr. Otto?
Yes.
Mr. Foss?
Yes.
Ms. Smith?
Yes.
Mr. Weiskopf?
Yes.
Mr. Kunkel?
Yes.
And Mr. Cho?
Yes.
Okay. Motion has been unanimously approved. Is there any new business? Audience participation. Any audience participation? Any additional staff reports?
Just the comment on the thing that I'm passing around, or Chris, it's a single-page memo attaching the database. Basically, it's a summary of all of the MOR DRB cases between 1991, when we first started processing these, and 2015, so it did not include the case today, of course. And what this first sheet does is summarizes, the question that was asked of me last time was, can you help us understand how many adaptive reuses, how many teardowns? So what I've done here is provide two little summary tables broken down by the time frame, sort of MOR first generation, so 1990 to 2003, and MOR the second generation. Because in 2003 and 4, of course, there were numerous changes to the MOR district, as well as composition of this board and the adoption of the design guidelines. So I thought it was important to divide those two time frames. So as you can see in the first time frame, 1990 to 2003, 4 adaptive reuse cases were approved. At that time, adaptive reuse was reviewed by the DRB, or unlike now, which is an administrative approval. There were 4 additions or major renovations, or in some cases, new structures added to the back of a lot that were approved. One of those was approved, and then there was an issue identified, and so that approval was actually voided. And contrasted with the number of teardowns in that time period, there were 3 approved, 2 were denied, and that was on the same site, which then was revised and eventually approved later on. As one of those approved, and 1 was withdrawn. That one notably was on the Ricker House. In the second time frame, 2004 to 2015, a number of administrative reviews for minor renovations. A lot of those are, I need to repair my stairs and add a railing, or I need to do this to meet building code now. So 7 of those were approved administratively. There's been 1 adaptive reuse approved administratively, 2 additions or major renovations that would have required MOR DRB review in that time period. Those both were last year, the garage on Elm Street and the multi-family apartment building at 611 West Elm Street. No, I'm sorry. Take that back. That goes in the next category. So under that was the garage of last year and 1 from earlier. Teardowns approved was the 611 West Elm last year, and then there was a denial And the specifics of each of those, or a summary of the specifics of each of those, appears on the following tables.
Any board comments on this? Well, thank you very much for putting this together. It's very comprehensive, and perhaps we'll have some comments on it later on, perhaps at the next meeting once we have an opportunity to look at this a little bit.
I guess one comment or
Yeah.
question would be: is this within that 11-year period from 2004 to 15? And I know that there was probably a recession in between there, but is this the volume? And I don't know how you'll answer this, but is this the type of volume that you want, that the city would like to see for either adaptive reuse or new construction in a district designed to hopefully encourage this kind of development for?
Well, the zoning regulations are in place to regulate development. The zoning ordinance doesn't always try to encourage a particular kind of development. Yes, the intent of the MOR does include wanting to encourage some adaptive reuse, and I believe at the last meeting or the meeting before talked a little bit about how that is done by incentivizing through an administrative review rather than a process like this. So it's just a matter of, in a property rights state, that the person that owns the property has an opportunity to go down either one of two paths. One of those would be the adaptive reuse path, or one of those could be, needing to do a tear down or a major renovation path. The ordinance is set in place in order to regulate each of those paths, not necessarily to put you in one or two of those paths.
Do you have a follow-up comment on that, Matt?
No, I guess as a new board member, I'm trying to understand my role on the MOR. Is it to encourage or see cases like this that are designed within the requirements of, or the design guidelines of MOR, and kind of, promote that? Or is it seems from the 90s, from 2003, it seems like there's a lot of adaptive reuse, but not a lot of new construction. And I know that was a conversation maybe at the last one, is that MOR is this, or it is this, or it is not this.
Well, in essence, the board exists to review new projects against the guidelines. So because adaptive reuse projects are administrative projects, you don't see those. So it'd be difficult for you to be able to weigh in on those if that isn't under your purview.
Thanks.
Okay, any other comments on this document or anything else? I think this constitutes the study session. Well, do I have a motion for adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, meeting adjourned.